with me. Everyone has a reason to live. I live for revenge.
Blade & Soul is a game that most people know has taken its sweet time coming over to North America. It's a fantasy martial arts MMORPG that shares a fully voiced and interesting story with a really in-depth and unique combat system, and I've never experienced anything like it before. However, before this game even came out in the States, another version of Blade & Soul came to us first in the form of an animated series, and this is what I will be talking about today. Blade & Soul is one of those shows that really went above my expectations, and I don't usually come across a series that isn't good at first and slowly gets better as time goes on. Most of the time, I'm either watching shows that turn out just like I thought they would, or I'm intentionally making myself suffer through something horrible. However, just because this series managed to keep me watching for all 13 episodes, does that mean it's worth your time? I'll be answering that question as we go into this review for the 2014 animated series, Blade & Soul. Blade & Soul follows the story of Alka, an emotionless swordswoman whose goal is to avenge her master's death at the hands of Jin So-yoon, the leader of the Flower Monks who controls the power of impurity, who is also accompanied by her two partners, Gubang, a very strong and imposing giant, and Yura, Jin So-yoon's cold and ruthless right hand. Throughout her journey, Alka tries to find clues on their whereabouts, and she meets people along the way who help her in that direction, as well as some who challenge her motives for revenge. She also goes through an internal struggle when she has to question her master's teachings, her own code of conduct, and what it means to truly live by the sword. One of the things I really enjoyed about this show is how they managed to keep the story of Alka as engaging as they did. I don't really like characters who have little to no expression, and for the most part I was thinking it wasn't going to go anywhere. At times, Alka might seem like a boring character archetype, but as the events of the show took place, I found myself getting more invested in the show and wanting to see it through to the end. Also, the appearance of the side characters was kept very brief, and for the most part, they didn't overstay their welcome. I like that because these other people weren't really developed enough as characters to be anything more than what we see them as when they're first introduced, which is good to me since they only really show up when it's necessary, and I think that's when they're used the best. They aren't supposed to overshadow Alka's story, and by taking a back seat to her, we see them developing Alka's personality instead, which I think is a much better use for them considering the way the story's done. For the most part, you're only really getting the story through Alka because everything else that happens will eventually revolve around her in some way. There's not much to go into based on the plot that hasn't been said already, but that's really all there is to it. We're watching the development of a character, and while that may be all there is to Blade & Soul as the series goes on, you really come to appreciate the effort when you know where to look. It's also worth noting that while the story itself isn't anything particularly new, it's handled very well, and as the series progresses, the effects of the Master's teachings are brought into light more often, which makes it more of a show about lessons taught through the actions of others, and learning from those experiences. Some of my favorite episodes in the series are when it revolves around one of these lessons, and it makes for a good watching experience.
問うあるか。その剣はお前のなんだ。
Now, this is where I start to have problems with the show, and it doesn't take long when watching the series to figure out why. Alka aside, certain characters don't really feel interesting enough to make you find anything of value within them that isn't already apparent, and the villains are even more boring than they appear to be. It's also kind of funny to me how the main trio are arguably the only good characters, while the villains are pretty lackluster in both personality and likability. To start off, we have our protagonist, Alka. She's a member of the Clan of the Sword, who is very skilled in combat, so much so that she can kill anyone with one strike to the neck. Throughout the start of the series, there isn't really much to say because she's an emotionless assassin who doesn't speak unless she's spoken to, and only has a one-track mind for the most part. She's actually her worst at this point, and I thought she wouldn't have any redeeming qualities, but as the story progresses, I saw real change within her personality and how she goes about fighting her battles. However, even with her character changes, the only thing that makes this interesting is what she goes through, and not really her as a character. I think this is due to the fact that she's very quiet and doesn't have any conversations about herself, because there isn't anything to say that isn't already known by everyone. Next we have the main trio, Soha, Jewel, and Yahara. They seem to be connected to each other in some way through Alka, and I guess that as a group who constantly run into one another frequently, they can come off okay in these moments. However, individually they're completely different. I would say Soha is definitely the weakest of the bunch, as I feel she goes through a cycle once you meet her. She's trying to chase a bounty, and whenever that opportunity comes up, she never manages to claim it, and later on we'll most likely see her drinking again. It's not particularly funny, but I don't think she's supposed to be either, which is why I can't tell what they were going for with this character. She's very skillful with a gun, but that's probably the best thing about her. Second on the list is Jewel, the leader of the pleasure gang. She's second on the list because outside of her job as leader, we get to see her in a more interesting light when it comes to her gang. She feels much more human when in their company, and we can see that she cares deeply for everyone who joins her. Outside of that, she's a pretty tough woman who won't back down from anyone who messes with her. She's also the most help to Alka, as they both have common goals and is willing to help her out because she's being chased down by the Palom Empire. She's also the first character to make Alka question something about herself, which in turn starts a more interesting part of Alka's journey. And third, there's Yahara, the proprietress at the Tomun Inn. She's a person with a lot of connections within her business and someone who seems to know more than she appears to. Yahara is definitely the strongest of the three because while being someone that rarely bares her fangs, she has the best fighting ability of the three, as well as being the only character to have a much closer connection to Alka than we're led to believe. Overall, she's very calm and composed and only cares about the business that she runs. Also, for reasons I can't explain, Yahara is definitely the biggest influence in Alka's story. Besides these minor details, that's all I can really get out of any of them, as these three don't really become different throughout the rest of the show, with the exception of one of them. But they also don't travel together with Alka at every moment, so it's not as bad as you might think. And finally, we get to the three villains, the Flower Monks. I can actually summarize them really quick, so this won't take long. Gubang is the big, strong, tough guy who can't speak a language, yet his team can understand him. Yura is a cold, bloodthirsty fighter who relays intel to a team about Alka's whereabouts and anything else related to the Palom Empire. And Jin So-yoon is a person who has as much personality as a brick wall. These guys have to be the worst thing about this series, as they don't really do anything outside of pestering Alka and trying to kill her because it's their job. Obviously they're supposed to because Alka's a threat to the Palom Empire, but outside of that, nobody but Jin So-yoon seems to have a grudge with Alka. And even that's pretty weak because it's never really explained why she dislikes her so much. At least with Gubang, he has nothing to do other than hit things, so his purpose is laid out, no matter how lazy it is. Yura comes off more as a leader than Jin So-yoon, but ultimately loses out on that position because Jin So-yoon is more powerful. Also, their reasons for killing Alka isn't really mentioned either. They just say that she's a threat, but a threat to what? Their lives? I guess, but I don't think it's a strong enough reason to go after her at all, since it would be much more interesting to elaborate on the relationship between Jin So-yoon and Alka. I could also make the argument that Alka was never a threat to them until they killed Master Hong, and at that point I would ask the question, why would they even kill him in the first place? Unfortunately, I have the answer to that question, and once it's revealed, it leaves you with more questions than answers. Overall, they're pretty bad characters and seem to only exist as a means for there to be a conflict in the story, and to top it off, the episodic characters have more of a reason to exist, because at least they manage to have a purpose. For what it's worth, the sound isn't too bad, but it's pretty standard and nothing too extraordinary. One that I've noticed a lot is how the killing blows from blades sound exactly the same, so that one kinda stuck with me. When it comes to the music, I've noticed a couple of tracks ripped straight from the game, and I have no problem with that because I actually enjoy the game's music and it fits very well within the series. The opening theme, Sayonara Usotsuki, and the ending theme, Rainbow, aren't necessarily great songs, but I would say they grow on you after a couple of episodes. It doesn't make them any better, but I think you won't worry about them as much. Personally, I find the ending theme a little bit better than the opening, which just reminds me of a generic action show. I think the most problems come down to the visuals and the animation, and it's by far the most obvious one. In some cases, the animation can look very good, and at times I'm reminded of how great it is in the opening of the anime. However, when you come across these moments in the show, it starts to become very obvious that visuals were definitely not a high point in the series, and laziness can be shown if I could say anything concerning looks. You'll notice characters with weird looking faces, scenes being recycled within a few seconds of being shown, people that look really weird from a distance, scenes with animations not even playing, and some more minor issues in that regard. I actually did end up laughing at some of these, but thankfully it's mostly in the mundane parts of the show that aren't really the most important parts. I think in this case the much better parts of the animation outweigh the bad, and it comes to sort of a middle ground with the good aspects being some of my favorite parts, such as the scenes where they're showing like Fields of Heaven's spirit because it just looks really nice to me. And the worst parts being the funniest parts of the show where you start to notice like all the animation issues. There was also some 3D used for the show, but it's not that much. It's only ever like once or twice, and it's only ever good when it doesn't conflict with any of the 2D animation. I have to say that my initial impression of the show was actually quite different from what I had anticipated. Considering what I've seen and played in the game, I was expecting some higher level of fan service as a major selling point considering the large female cast. However, to my surprise, they managed to keep it the most downplayed aspect of the series and focus more on Alka's character development, so I have to give credit where credit is due. They managed to keep a level of restraint and save that kind of stuff for the last episode, where it really doesn't have any context to the actual story, and even then it's not as gratuitous as most ecchi would be, and it's actually kind of fun to watch. The story was also fairly consistent with its theme of revenge and never strayed from it at all, as most episodes feel connected to each other in some way when it pertains to Alka learning from her master's teachings. This doesn't excuse the fact that most side characters who are introduced in each episode feel incredibly convenient based on what it's about, and are quickly thrown aside once the episode ends. I tend to think that if a character is killed off in a show, it'll only have a real lasting effect on me if they were interesting and likable enough to warrant such feelings. In Blade and Soul's case, this doesn't happen too often, and the one time that it does, it's very short-lived. The fight scenes are also pretty boring for an action series, as most fights only last for 1 or 2 hits, and if 2 characters are relevant enough, they'll get multiple hits, with one person being pinned down or defeated. And it's pretty obvious to find out which scenes those are. If you watch the cutscenes from the game, I would say that they're a little bit better, but if I remember correctly, they might be similar to this. Overall, I'd have to say that I enjoyed the show and would rate it above average, as it's worth a watch for a 12-episode series, and it has a satisfying conclusion, with little to no loose ends that, if you do find any, you'd probably be able to wrap them up on your own, as they're not too important. As a short little series about Alka's revenge and how she finds her purpose in life through the teachings of Han Moon, it makes for a decent show if you have nothing else on the watch list. With that in mind, I give Blade and Soul a very strong 6 out of 10. Even with its shortcomings, Blade and Soul manages to be a pretty good show. Its story and character development are some of the best parts about it, and depending on how you've seen the characters depicted before watching it, you'll be pleasantly surprised to know that it neither adds nor takes away anything from the series itself. If nothing else, I'd say it's worth watching if you need something to hold you over, and with its conclusion, there's no need for a second season, so go out and watch it. Alright guys, that about wraps up this review. If you enjoyed it, leave a like. If you have any thoughts, post them in the comments section below, and I'll see you in the next video.